Historians just prove that the most famous act of cultural destruction in history never actually happened, and what replaced it is somehow worse. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is one of the foundational tragedies of Western civilization. One fire, one night, one irreversible loss. The story is clean, dramatic, and almost universally believed. The villain rotates depending on who is telling the story. Julius Caesar, a Christian mob, a Muslim caliph, but the catastrophe itself has always seemed certain, except it isn't. Classicist Lionel Casson, in his foundational study of ancient libraries, and, more recently, papyrologist Roger Bagnall, in his work on Alexandrian book culture, have both argued that the evidence for any single catastrophic destruction simply does not exist. Researchers combing through papyrological catalogs, surviving late antique citations, and the painstaking archaeology of missing texts have now assembled a picture that contradicts the myth at every level. The Library of Alexandria was not burned. It was not destroyed in any single event. It was slowly, quietly abandoned, defunded, deprioritized, and forgotten across centuries, so gradual that no Alexandrian alive at the time would have described living through a catastrophe. They would have described it as a budget problem. And that reframing from fire to silence, from villain to indifference, changes everything about what this story means for the world we live in right now. Because if the greatest concentration of human knowledge ever assembled did not die in fire, but in silence, in unopened rooms, in unread scrolls, in salaries that stopped being paid, then the mechanism that erased the ancient world is a mechanism that is still fully operational. It is running right now, in your century, in your city, possibly on the shelf behind you. Let us begin where the historians began, with the fire that everyone thinks they know about. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar, trapped in the harbor of Alexandria during a civil war against the forces loyal to Ptolemy XIII, ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet. The flames spread from the ships to the dockside warehouses. This much is not in dispute. Roman historians recorded it. Caesar himself, in his own commentaries, alluded to fire in the port district. For roughly 2,000 years, this incident has been treated as the moment the library burned. There is a problem. Several problems, actually, stacked on top of each other in a way that any competent investigator would have noticed centuries ago if the story had not been so satisfying to keep telling. The first problem is geographical. The library, more precisely, the Mausoleum, the great research institution of which the library was one component, was not located in the harbor district. It sat inland, in the Bruchillon quarter, adjacent to the royal palace complex. A fire on the docks would have needed to travel through several districts of a densely populated Hellenistic city to reach it. There is no ancient source that describes such a spread. The second problem is the ancient sources themselves. Strabo, the Greek geographer, visited Alexandria roughly 25 years after Caesar's fire. He described the Mausoleum in detail, its covered walkways, its dining hall, its scholars in residence, supported by public funds. He did not describe a ruin. He did not describe a rebuilt institution recovering from catastrophe. He described a working library, staffed and functional, in the 20s BCE. The third problem is the shape of the intellectual record. If the library had truly burned in 48 BCE, we would expect a sudden, sharp discontinuity in the citation of Alexandrian texts by later authors. We would expect a generation of scholars, writing in the decades immediately after, to lament the loss. Instead, we get the opposite. Alexandrian scholarship continues, uninterrupted, for another 300 years. Ptolemy the astronomer works there in the 2nd century CE. Galen the physician consults its holdings. Diophantus writes his mathematical treatises within its walls or in institutions descended from it. Something did burn in 48 BCE. It was probably a warehouse of scrolls awaiting export, the ancient equivalent of a shipping container, holding perhaps 40,000 book rolls destined for sale abroad. That is a real loss. It is not the loss of the library. And the moment you accept that distinction, the entire mythology of the single catastrophic night begins to dissolve, and you are left with a much harder and much more uncomfortable question. If it did not burn in 48 BCE, when did it die? And more importantly, how? The second false assumption. Here is where most people, having just been told that Caesar didn't do it, immediately reach for the next candidate on the list, the Christian mob of 391 CE, tearing down the Serapeum under Bishop Theophilus, or the Muslim general Amr ibn al-As in 642 CE, allegedly ordering the scrolls burned to heat the city's bathhouses. Both of these stories share a structural feature with the Caesar story. They are dramatic, they have a villain, they compress a diffuse historical process into a single identifiable moment of destruction, ideally with a named individual to blame, and they collapse under the same kind of scrutiny. The Serapeum in 391 was a temple, not the main library. It held books, yes, a daughter collection, perhaps 10% the size of the main Mausian holdings at its peak, and by 391 that collection had already been depleted for over a century. The mob that destroyed the temple was destroying a religious site in the context of an anti-pagan campaign. Contemporary Christian sources, hostile to paganism and eager to record victories, mention the destruction of cult objects and statues in extensive detail. They do not mention burning books. This is not silence from an author who might have had reason to suppress the fact. This is silence from authors who would have celebrated it. The 642 story is worse. It appears nowhere in the historical record for nearly 600 years after the alleged event. Its first attestation is in a 13th century source, written by a Christian author in the context of Crusade-era polemic against Islam. No Byzantine chronicler mentions it. No Arab historian of the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, or 11th centuries mentions it. The bathhouse detail 6 months of heating is a rhetorical flourish, not a logistical claim any historian has been able to substantiate. Each of these stories was constructed to serve the political needs of the century that produced it. None of them describes what actually happened. What actually happened is more disturbing, because it does not involve villains at all. It involves accountants, the salaries that stopped. The Mausian of Alexandria was, from its founding under Ptolemy I in the early 3rd century BCE, a state-funded research institution. Its scholars did not pay to work there. They were paid to work there. They received stipends from the royal treasury. They received free meals in the common dining hall. They received housing. They received, essentially, everything a modern research fellow receives from a well-endowed university, with the significant additional benefit of not being required to teach. This model worked for as long as there was a Ptolemaic treasury capable of funding it. When Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BCE, the funding model changed. The Mausian was preserved. The Romans understood its prestige value, but it was now funded by the Roman imperial administration rather than by a local dynasty whose entire political identity was bound up with the institution's success. The scholars still received their stipends, but the stipends now came from further away and were subject to the priorities of an empire whose center of gravity lay elsewhere. In the 2nd century CE, the Emperor Caracalla, angry at satirical verses composed by Alexandrian intellectuals, cut the stipends. Some scholars left. The institution contracted. It did not close. But it lost, in a single administrative decision, a significant fraction of its working scholars, and those scholars did not return because their students had gone to study under them in the cities where they had relocated, and the network effect that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean began, slowly, to reverse. This is the mechanism. This is what actually killed the library, not fire, not mobs, budgets. Because here is the thing about a library, any library, ancient or modern, that most people fail to understand. A library is not a warehouse of objects. A library is a process. Papyrus scrolls, in the Egyptian climate, have a working lifespan of perhaps 200 to 300 years before they become too brittle to unroll safely. To maintain a collection, scribes must continuously copy the deteriorating scrolls onto fresh papyrus. This requires salaried scribes. It requires a supply of fresh papyrus. It requires supervisors who know which scrolls are approaching the end of their physical life and which texts must be prioritized for copying when resources are limited. Cut the funding, and the copying stops. Stop the copying, and the collection begins to die at the rate of natural material decay. Not in a night, over centuries. A scroll that would have been copied 5 times between the 3rd century BCE and the 7th century CE is instead copied twice, and then not at all. And then it crumbles. And then the text it contained exists nowhere else, and then it is gone. Nobody notices. That is the point. Nobody notices because there was never a moment when a decision was made to lose the text. There was only a moment when the scribe who would have copied it was not hired, because the budget from Rome was smaller this decade than last decade, and someone in an office made a reasonable, defensible, boring administrative choice about which positions to leave vacant. What we can actually prove. The strongest evidence for the slow decay model, rather than the catastrophic fire model, comes from a source that most people would never think to consult. It comes from garbage. Specifically, it comes from Oxyrhynchus, a provincial Egyptian town roughly 160 kilometers south of Alexandria, where in the late 19th century, archaeologists began excavating the town's ancient rubbish heaps. The dry desert climate had preserved discarded papyri in enormous quantities, over 500,000 fragments, still being cataloged today, more than a century after the excavation began. What the Oxyrhynchus papyri give us is a statistical sample of what ordinary literate Egyptians were reading in each century of the ancient world. We can count the fragments, we can date them, we can identify the texts, and when we do that, a specific pattern emerges. Between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE, precisely the period in which the library supposedly burned to the ground under Caesar, the citation and circulation of Alexandrian texts remains stable. We find fragments of Callimachus, of Apollonius Rhodius, of the grammarians and the astronomers, in numbers consistent with an active, functioning, well-copied literature. Then, beginning in the 3rd century CE, the numbers begin to decline. Not all at once, not for all authors equally, but steadily. Some texts that appear in 100 fragments in the 2nd century appear in 12 fragments in the 4th century, in 2 fragments in the 6th century, and in 0 fragments thereafter. This is what a library dying of neglect looks like in the archaeological record. This is not what a library dying of fire looks like. A fire produces a cliff in the data. Neglect produces a slope. The slope is what we find. Homo sapiens has not changed neurologically in 150,000 years. The scribes copying scrolls in 3rd century Alexandria were not less intelligent, less careful, or less devoted than the scribes copying scrolls in 3rd century BCE Alexandria. They were, in every cognitive respect, the same people. What had changed was not their capacity. What had changed was the institutional structure that funded their work. Take away that structure, and identical minds produce dramatically different outcomes, because it is not the mind alone, that preserves a civilization's memory. It is the mind supported by the salary, supported by the treasury, supported by the political will to keep funding a thing whose value is difficult to measure in any given fiscal year. The objection that historians have already answered. At this point, a careful listener will raise a reasonable objection. If the library died slowly, over centuries of underfunding, then how do we explain the absence of any late antique author lamenting the process? Surely someone, watching the collection shrink year by year, would have written about it? Surely we would have letters, complaints, appeals to the emperor for restored funding? Historians raised exactly this objection themselves, and they found the answer in a place that, once you see it, is obvious. The people best positioned to notice the decline were the people whose livelihoods depended on not naming it. A scholar who writes to the emperor complaining that his institution is dying is a scholar drawing attention to the possibility that his own stipend might be next on the list of cuts. The rational strategy, the strategy that a functioning bureaucracy incentivizes, is to keep doing your reduced job with your reduced resources, and to write, in your official correspondence, about the excellent work still being accomplished. This is exactly what we find in the surviving letters of late Alexandrian scholars. They report progress. They report continuity. They do not report collapse because reporting collapse is not in their interest, and because from inside the process, the shrinkage is slow enough that each individual year feels normal. The people who could have raised the alarm did not. The people who might have listened were far away in Constantinople or Rome, occupied with other problems, and the scrolls continued not being copied, quietly, in rooms where fewer and fewer scribes came to work. The uncomfortable modern parallel. There is a reason this story matters beyond the specific historical question of what happened in one Egyptian city between the 3rd century BCE and the 7th century CE. It matters because the mechanism it describes has not gone away. Every civilization builds institutions whose function is to preserve knowledge across generations. Universities, archives, museums, national libraries, research collections, specialist journals, and every one of these institutions is funded, ultimately, by decisions made in rooms where the people making the decisions are not experts in the specific fields whose preservation is at stake. They are administrators, allocating scarce resources across competing demands, and the demand from the Humanities Archive is competing against the demand from the transportation budget, which is competing against the demand from the healthcare system. The scribe who was not hired in Alexandria in 240 CE is the archivist who is not hired in your city in 2024 CE. The difference is not one of principle. It is one of scale and speed, and even the speed is not as different as we would like to believe. Digital preservation, which was supposed to solve the problem of material decay, has introduced new problems: file format obsolescence, storage medium degradation, institutional custody gaps that are, in aggregate, producing loss rates comparable to those of ancient papyrus. A 10-year-old digital file on an unmaintained server is closer to a 200-year-old papyrus scroll than most people would like to admit. None of this involves a villain. That is the terrifying part. The Library of Alexandria was not murdered. It was not attacked. It was not, in any dramatic sense, destroyed. It was underfunded, decade by decade, by administrators making defensible choices, until one day the last scribe finished his shift and did not come back, and the scrolls sat on their shelves, and the shelves sat in their rooms, and the rooms sat inside a city that had other priorities, and the papyrus kept doing what papyrus does when nobody copies it. What was actually lost? We do not know in any complete sense what disappeared. That is part of the horror. The catalogs of the Mausian in its peak years listed titles in the hundreds of thousands. The number of ancient texts that survive today, in any form, is a few thousand. The ratio of what we have to what existed is somewhere between 1 and 5%. Between 95 and 99% of the written output of the classical world is gone, and we know only fragments of what it contained, a title cited by a later author, a summary in a compilation, a single quotation preserved because someone found it useful. We know there were 9 plays by Sappho. We have fragments of 4. We know Aristotle wrote a treatise on comedy. We have none of it. We know there were mathematicians whose work Archimedes cited as foundational and whose names we still have, but whose theorems exist for us only as things that Archimedes assumed his readers already understood. Inside the collections that carried the medical knowledge of Herophilus and the astronomical models that preceded Ptolemy, entire branches of investigation were quietly abandoned mid-argument. The scribes who could have transmitted them forward were not paid. The scrolls that held them were not copied. And the questions those scholars were asking, questions we might now be building on, in fields we do not yet realize are missing, their foundations became questions no one alive knew how to ask. The Library of Alexandria did not burn. The Library of Alexandria was allowed to be forgotten, one unfilled position at a time, across 400 years of administrators who each made a small, reasonable, boring choice about what to fund and what to defer, and the sum of those small choices was the loss of most of what the ancient world had learned. The next time you hear someone say that the library burned in a single night, remember that the truth is worse. It did not require a fire. It did not require a mob. It did not require a general with a torch. It required only what every civilization has, in abundance, at every moment of its existence: a budget, a set of competing priorities, and a willingness to defer the copying of the scrolls until next year. Next year came. The scribes did not.